Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's Ask Why session, which is our third discussion on this year's Ask Why series. And today's topic is Ask Why. Why is the Earth sick? It's a big question. And we have two notable speakers joining us to hopefully answer any questions we might have. Firstly, we have Kate Clayton joining us from Australia. She's a research officer at Trobe Asia and chief operations officer at Young Australians in International Affairs. And she happens to be a dear friend of our colleagues in Australia. And we also have Alistair Ritchie, Director of Asia Pacific Sustainability at Asia Society's Policy Institute. Today's format will be slightly different. It will be led and moderated by a couple of our cohorts, Mark Hopkins and Nazifa Rafa. And Mark is from Australia, but currently he is studying at Seoul National University, majoring in area studies. And he is currently interning with the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund, and has also worked previously at the Global Green Growth Institute in Seoul. Nazifa Rafa is from Bangladesh, and she is currently studying at the University of Cambridge, pursuing her studies in environmental policy. So I will hand over the mic now to Mark and Nazifa. Guys, here we go.
Thank you, Yvonne. It's really nice to have Alistair and Kate today with us. So we had an amazing session last time where we discussed the sort of disruptors in gender equality, the disruptors that are reversing gender equality in many areas. So we basically focused on one specific cause for gender inequality issues, and it had been social norms. And because of my background in environmental sciences, the panel made me think about the other potential reasons that could be contributing to such issues. And I've been quite involved in a lot of research work, and it led me to believe that there are some other factors, such as environmental issues and climate change, for example, that were leading to gender inequality issues. And so I feel like it's quite an appropriate time to have a panel session on this topic, especially with the COP26 going on. I feel like we'll have a very productive session ahead. So in the perspective of Bangladesh, for example, I felt that climate change was contributing to inequalities both within the country and in Bangladesh as a whole, for example, because I feel like Bangladesh presents the clearest example of the manifestations of climate change impacts. So we have sea level rise in the southern part. We have like very high temperatures in the past few years. So for example, in one of my studies, I came across one issue specifically, for example, sea level rise, which is sort of contaminating their groundwater sources. And I know for a fact that because women are more involved in water collection responsibilities, it's increasing the unavailability of clean water is sort of exacerbating their water collection responsibilities. They're made to travel further to collect water. And because of the salt water, they're also being exposed to things like miscarriages. So what happens is in Bangladesh, we have like a population growth trend that's moving towards a positive direction, but that's not the same for the southern part. In the southern part, it's actually going in the reverse direction because of the miscarriages. And again, the prejudice against women who lose their children is not helping the situation. Also, the natural disasters have been quite severe. For example, a few years ago, we had the super cyclonic storm Amphan. And we have many such storms coming up and it's affecting the rural poor the most because they do not have proper adaptive capacities. So usually they're not really the ones to evacuate because they do not have they have very little resources to move to safety, to move to a safe place. And when we think about it, for example, the city areas, they're quite safe, but in the southern part, which is much more exposed to natural disasters, they're going to be more in danger in the future. So this is why I believe that inequality has really exacerbated many of the issues. Climate change has exacerbated many of the inequality issues within Bangladesh. But Bangladesh as a whole has been, I've been quite impressed by the steps taken in Bangladesh. For example, the promises of renewable energy sources, like I think about 40,000 megawatts of energy sources is promised to come from renewable sources in the future, which I'm optimistic about. But I think much more attention should be paid in the adaptation strategies, because things are already happening in Bangladesh. So that's what I've been. These are just some of the things that come to my mind when I think about how the link between climate change and inequalities in my own country, and some things that I've experienced. So I would like to hear how climate change is being perceived in your countries, and I would like to move on to my cohort. So, for example, I know Shanu's probably can share similar experiences, because Pakistan and Bangladesh share similar socioeconomic contexts. So, Shanu's, how has it been? Like, how has it been perceived in in Pakistan?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Nazifa, for giving me the floor to speak about a topic which is really close to my heart. As I belong to a region which is home to 4 biggest mountains: Himalayas, K2, Hindu Kush, Karakoram, and many glaciers. So our major productivity depends on agriculture, livestock, and tourism. So, but even a slight change in temperature affects our major sources of income. And we witness the negative impacts of climate change on a daily basis. And it exacerbates the existing problems within the country, like inequality, joblessness, migration, climate refugees, etc. But it's actually not the case of my country or my region, but it's the case and the story, the situation of every state in the world. But the impacts and the effects disproportionately differ from country to country. As we can see that in developing countries, the climate change exacerbated many issues, but in developed countries, it's not the case. Even they have good technology to cope up with the situation, and they have a very good finance so that they can cover up their losses. But compared to comparing this situation to the developed countries, it's totally opposite. So now what we have to do is now here the question is, who is responsible for all this happening? As developed countries are responsible for less than 1% of the global emission, but still developing countries are suffering the most. So now the developing countries need help from developed countries to mitigate the issues. And we as developing countries are suffering daily, as developing countries are suffering the causes and effects of climate change on like daily basis. And because of the technological issues and other financial issues, it's hard for us to cope up with the situation. And thank you so much for, again, thank you for giving me the floor to speak about the topic.
Thank you, Shanu. So I wonder, has the experience been quite different for, it is true that climate change it's a very global problem, and there are different impacts of it across different nations. So how has climate change been perceived in Australia, for example? Dylan, has it been very different from how it has been in Bangladesh and Pakistan?
I think in Australia, climate change has really been suddenly brought into a lot of bigger discussions and dialogues. Like I think about, for example, youth protests and high school students, and also in terms of like our two major parties, Labour and Liberal, and how like the moment you shift onto one side, then suddenly you capture 50% or you capture another 50%. And I think because climate change is really an issue which does require that global mobilization in a way, by having climate change and policies related, even minor policies like carbon tax or even minor policies, by having them blown out of perspective or having them put into these global dialogues, it's inhibiting a lot of progress. But I'm really curious, maybe for Kate, because I know you're working in this area, what are your thoughts on Australia's situation and climate change at the moment?
Yeah, thanks so much for that one, Daniel, and as well for the other perspectives here today. Before I start talking, I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people. That's something we do in Australia. We do an acknowledgement of country before we do these kind of panels, both in person and online. So I'm talking today from the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation. So that's kind of paying my respects. And I think, as has been discussed earlier, in that it's Indigenous communities that are going to be the most affected by climate change. You know, women are 2/3 of the global poor. They're going to be the most affected. So I think it's kind of looking at how disproportionately it's going to affect different lands of Australia. Like the land of Australia is massive compared to all these other places. So the different effects of climate change are going to differ. So I'm from regional Victoria, where we have bushfires for, decades. I grew up in the Macedon Ranges, which had the Ash Wednesday fires, which were some of the worst fires in Australia. So it's kind of always been something in the back of my head. I think more than the average urban population in Australia, it's because we've always had to adapt to these things for hundreds of years, just because of our flora and fauna. We're naturally quite a dry country. I grew up during a massive period of drought. So it's all something. But again, as someone who's middle class, white, I now live in suburban Victoria, the concerns are quite different compared to my family who are now in Victoria and are facing kind of mass droughts, ongoing fire. I remember I missed quite a bit of school just because the school shut down because of the bushfires and buses couldn't get there and those sorts of things. But I think Australia, we have this kind of connection to land. We kind of see ourselves nationally as these bush people, land of the fair go. When you think of Australia, you don't necessarily think of the cities. You might think of Crocodile Dundee and all of these sorts of things. But I think that's a little bit disconnected to when we're talking about climate change, because I think broadly the Australian political class kind of turn a blind eye to it. They much more focus on the economic security impacts of climate change, so our iron ore, our trade and all those types of things, and the kind of people-to-people effects of climate change. Because climate change isn't going to affect the ruling class. It's going to affect the average person. And I think there's this disconnect in Australia where we'd much rather kind of look at climate change as a way to improve our economic choices, and we're looking at climate change as something that affects our iron ore, not something that affects people. And I think that's massively affecting our relationships with Asia, because we look at the Asian region, Bangladesh, the Pacific, Sri Lanka, all of these kind of Southeast Asian, very maritime. It's a really maritime region, which I think is kind of forgotten in the broader discussions, are going to be affected first and at the worst. And kind of as a bigger state in just size in Asia, that's something we're going to have to kind of grapple with. And I think Australia, in South Korea in the past week, we've signed a green energy deal and kind of a commitment to net zero emissions by 2050, but where everyone else has their net zero emissions for 2030, Australia is still at that 2050, and we're kind of relying on green tech magically being created in the next 30 years to fix our emissions. And we're doing quite a lot with South Korea. And I think South Korea is a really great opportunity to extend that. They're our fourth biggest trading partner when it comes to iron ore. So that's something we kind of want to fix as well. But I think when we're looking at Australia's contribution to climate change, I think we're contributing a lot more than other states our size. It's still a relatively small population, but we're contributing to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions way more than we should be. So I think there's a lot more that we can be doing. As you said, Dylan, it's kind of divided politically. Climate change has become this issue where you're either on the left, climate change, or on the right, you're not. And I think the media in Australia and the kind of control of the mining, because we do so much mining in Australia, because we have all this land, I think that's kind of overtaken it. And I think that's disappointing as a regional power that we're not looking after our neighbours in that way. We look at the Pacific, Tuvalu and Kiribati will be underwater, in our lifetimes as well. We have the Maldives. So I think there's a lot more that Australia can do. And I always feel kind of bad as an Australian coming to these discussions, knowing that we're such a famous climate laggard and have been since the 1990s. So I kind of always feel bad contributing to these discussions because you kind of feel responsible. And I think particularly as young people, we kind of bear a lot of that burden on our mental health. 60% of young people have climate change related anxiety and mental health. I know I do from growing up in bushfires, and I can only imagine that that's so much worse for people who are kind of experiencing the effects. So I think it's going to affect different sections of all societies different. But as you said, Nazifa, at the start, it's going to affect women and the global poor and those in rural communities first, and also much worse. And they're the kind of only contributing 1% to emissions. So inherently, climate change is just unfair, and it's quite frustrating in that way. But I think these discussions are important.
Thanks everyone for speaking so far. I just wanted to backtrack quickly, maybe especially for the sake as well of Kate and Alistair, that we had the cohort as a group with posted questions in our chat, and Nazifa and I had basically divided these under two broad themes, which are inequalities and also accountability. So those are the two things that we're going to be really trying to focus mainly on today. Obviously they're strongly linked. And we're talking a bit now about inequalities, but I also just wanted to give Alistair the chance to share your kind of opening thoughts on this massive topic. So yeah, over to you.
Yeah, in terms of my thoughts are more related to climate change mitigation. So would you like me to just talk about my opinions on the mitigation topic? It's not specifically around inequality or accountability. It's more generally about how to address the issues, how to mitigate GHG to achieve the climate mitigation targets. Is that
yeah,
is that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah. This can kind of shape our discussion, so that's good. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Mark. It's really great to have the chance to join this group and to speak to you all. And so I work mainly on greenhouse gas mitigation policy, and I was actually at COP last week as well. And you've already heard that in this meeting a mention about net zero goals, and you're probably familiar with the Paris Agreement and the various topics around that. So I wanted to talk a bit about carbon pricing, because that's also something that's being discussed in the COP, and it's also a key policy in Korea with the Korean emissions trading system. And there's discussion about a global carbon price and other topics related to that. So firstly, I wanted to say, well, why is this important? And then talk about how this can be implemented. So in terms of why carbon pricing is important, it's because it's trying to clearly, carbon dioxide is causing damage through global warming, and there's a price of that damage. And then assigning a price to that will motivate emitters to reduce their emissions. And so carbon pricing is most established in the EU. So the EU have got an emissions trading system. You might be familiar with it. It's been operating since 2005. And it's actually very successful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from the power sector. There's been a big change, a big shift away from coal, for example, towards renewables. And it's also a policy that's generating a lot of money through auction revenue recycling, and through an innovation fund to support companies to invest in more advanced technology to meet future net zero goals. And in particular, the type of carbon pricing that is most cost effective is an emissions trading system. Now that's the type in the EU, it's the type in Korea. China have just started an emissions trading system. And the reason it's most cost effective is because it enables emission reductions to happen where they're cheapest. So the benefit of that is that the total costs of reducing emissions are lower, and it means that countries can reach net zero goals more quickly and more cheaply. So the alternative carbon pricing is a tax, which is also a policy that's being adopted by different jurisdictions. Sometimes it's a ETS for some sectors, a tax for other sectors. So just coming to Korea as an example, it's interesting to think about a lot of the discussions at COP about what targets countries are making to reduce emissions by 2030 along the pathway to the 2050 net zero target. So Korea, for example, has recently announced a more ambitious 2030 target of a 40% reduction from, I think it's a 2017 baseline. And this is the NDC target. So each country has been encouraged to be more ambitious in their NDC targets. So in a country like Korea, one of the challenges, though, is the political status of this target, because it's not yet signed up in legislation. So there's a risk that next year, if a different political party gets in power, they might decide not to have this 40% target. They might want to make it less ambitious. So it's a challenge for countries that have where the policy is very connected to the political shifts. The benefit of the EU is that there's less sensitivity to these shifts because policy follows a different process. So that's one of the issues. And really, it's very important that 2030 is a time when significant reductions will have been made, because really that's essential to achieve the 2050 net zero goal. So that's one of the issues. And then the second, I guess, moving from your national level target, you then drop down to your individual policies to achieve that target. So in Korea, it would be the Korean emissions trading system, which covers over 70% of all the country's emissions. It's really big coverage. And it's been it's functioning quite successfully in terms of its operation. But it will need to have certain improvements, because so far it's not actually leading to much in the way of GHG reduction. So whilst in the EU, emission trading systems have resulted in a lot of reductions in the power sector, that's not happened so far in Korea. And the reason for that is because the carbon cost is not passed through into electricity prices, and it's not influencing power station dispatch, like shifting from coal to renewables. But next year, there will be some changes in the policy so that there will be fuel switching possibility, and also costs will be passed through. So that's a good thing that's happening. But what also needs to happen is that there needs to be a more ambitious target in the emissions trading system, because really the carbon price is a function of supply and demand. So the cap is entirely the key driver of the carbon price. So the tighter the cap, the higher the price, and you need a high price to drive GHG mitigation. So if the more ambitious target is maintained, that will then cascade down to a more ambitious cap, which would then create a higher carbon price. And then once this mechanism in the power sector is implemented, then they can shift from giving allocation freely to companies, which doesn't really motivate them to do a lot, to actually getting to pay in an auction. And the big benefit of that is that there's a huge amount of money that's raised, and that money can then be used to invest in new renewable technology, or particularly to meet net zero. There's a lot of huge technical change that needs to happen, like electrification of industry, hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen, carbon capture and utilization. So there's a lot of opportunity once the policy is properly implemented. Then also the industrial sector needs to decarbonize as well. So that will require probably a higher carbon price than the power sector. But once the once these funding mechanisms are established, then industry can be encouraged and supported to invest. The big thing with industry, I guess, is the competitiveness issue. We've heard a bit earlier about economic impacts and economic issues. So what's happening is that as policies become more ambitious, like in the EU, they're also protecting their own industry. So the EU has a proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism. You might have heard of that. And that's to try and prevent carbon leakage from EU companies outside. But what that's doing is actually creating the need for more ambitious carbon pricing in other parts of the world, so that they will not be penalised by the EU policy. And it's actually creating more motivation for countries to adopt more consistently ambitious policy. And as countries themselves become more ambitious, they'll seek to protect their own industry too. But it's interesting to think, in the discussions last week, there was also talk about a global carbon price. So, for example, including the US and China, India, EU, and perhaps reflecting the development status of the different countries, because different countries have got different abatement technologies. The other element to this, the other aspect to the Paris Agreement that's relevant to this is the international trading. So you might have heard about the discussions on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. That's about trading between one country and another to enable them to meet their NDC targets. And then, I guess, moving on, in terms of this, carbon pricing is one element of the picture. It's not the only policy, because renewable portfolio standards are very significant, and coal phase-out policy, car emission standards. So, but it's all part of the package, and there's actually quite a big momentum now in Asia towards this carbon pricing policy. I mentioned China, but also Indonesia have started a emission trading system this year for the power sector. Malaysia have announced they're planning to do something. Thailand. Some countries are following a tax route, like Taiwan, Singapore. But overall, it's a very dynamic area, and I think it's, given how close 2030 is to now, countries will need to be very quick in implementing very effective policies to really achieve these reductions. It's, in the past, countries have spent a long time thinking about stuff and have not actually done a lot. Korea is perhaps one example of a country that's actually made a quick implementation. The other thing I just wanted to say is that we're, in relation to this, as part of Asia Society, we're also having a study tour of EU and US on these topics, and we'll have a dissemination workshop in Seoul in February. So this will be where we're sharing learning from EU and US on Green New Deal and net zero goals. So it'd be, if any of you in the meeting are available for that, we'd be very interested to give you more details. So happy to discuss more, but that's really what I wanted to share really about carbon pricing, Mark.
Thank you. Okay, if it's possible for me to jump in at this point, first of all, it's great to hear your insights, Kate and Alistair. Thanks a lot for joining. And I wanted to jump in at this particular point in time because I think this carbon pricing and the carbon tax was a very interesting initial solution to try to include emissions into consumption decisions and the prices of goods. But I personally do not believe so much in such a scheme. And I really wondered, maybe one after the other, what, if you had to choose maybe one or two types of regulations what these would be. So, because where I'm coming from, and I think it's really interesting, is that this carbon pricing should be central to our discussion today, because as Ask Why, we really try, the guiding line is to relate to sustainability. And pricing, putting a price on like the carbon tax is literally trying to estimate how much it would cost further down the line, which is such a central issue in both cases. My issue mainly with this carbon tax is that it would be entirely passed down to consumers, and within a context of unequal exposition to climate change and its risks, then the price of climate change would also be disproportionately paid by usually the lower income groups that would consume more fuel or consumer goods that would be more highly taxed. So I was wondering, I mean, you mentioned a lot these emissions trading, emissions permits, maybe it's production regulations or the caps. Maybe Kate or Alistair, in a few words, which type of innovative regulation do you think has most promise? If there was a magical solution, we'd probably know it, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for those questions. I think and those points. So the concern that you've mentioned is about the costs being passed down to consumers. So, I mean, the whole point of carbon pricing is that the whole purpose of climate mitigation policy is to drive change in behavior, is to drive action to reduce emissions. So the whole purpose of carbon pricing is to pass through the carbon cost to organizations and to enable them to make decisions so that carbon cost is reflected in their decision making. Now, the point about where this cost can have a negative effect, perhaps on a consumer group or on an industry, then that needs to be carefully considered by the policymakers. In the case of industry, it could damage their competitiveness and it could cause carbon leakage. A factory could close down and there could be a new factory opening up that emits more. So that's I guess carbon leakage, and there are measures to protect against that. Free allocation, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a carbon leakage mitigation measure. Where it might impact on domestic houses, that could be dealt with through different policies in terms of protection of low-income houses, of fuel poverty. But it's interesting to see that the real experience in the UK, for example, where there's been very high costs imposed on the power sector, in fact, a carbon price floor, it doesn't, from my understanding, it hasn't led to increases in fuel poverty, because often what happens when electricity price goes up, consumption goes down, energy efficiency measures are more widely implemented. So I think it's a consideration, but ultimately, the whole purpose of the policy is to have an effect, and it is to create change. But I think within the question about a carbon tax or an emissions trading system is a different question. And I think the fundamental difference is the tax controls the price, whereas the trading controls the volume. And some countries opt for one instead of another because they want to control the volume, the total emissions reductions, and then that gives them certainty on the amount of reductions achieved by the policy. So China, for example, opted for the ETS instead of the tax for that reason. Some countries opt for a tax, like Singapore, because they have only a small country with not a big size of emissions, and they probably couldn't make a trading system work within a small jurisdiction. So there's other factors as well. But broadly speaking, I think that there are measures that can be taken. In fact, it was discussed in the EU about the auction revenue recycling money, which could be used also to support any negative distributional impacts on households. So I think there's a lot of ways that could be done to protect sensitive groups, and that needs to be carefully considered in the policy design.
Hi, Alistair. So I was wondering, do you think an international sort of emission trading scheme is feasible, like in an international level, instead of like we have a lot of regional emission trading schemes, but what could be the challenges when we want to establish sort of like an international market?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes is the answer. And in fact, with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, it's giving more motivation for countries to make their carbon price more similar to the EU, because if under the CBAM policy, if a country can demonstrate that it's got a similar price to the EU, it's no longer going to be penalized under that policy. So there's various technical aspects that are prerequisites to making this feasible. There's also political will. So in terms of technical aspects, it would be issues such as the scarcity of the allowances, which is ultimately the cap, and the way in which allowances are distributed, the allocation. Within that, it's the extent to which there's auctioning versus free allocation. Obviously, the MRV needs to be consistent, and there needs to be consistency about the interaction of the ETS with the outside world, like the offset policy, and then banking and borrowing, the flexibility mechanisms, perhaps market stability mechanisms, market oversight. But basically, it's EU has linked to Switzerland recently. California's linked to Quebec. So it is feasible. And I think the main motivation would be avoiding those trade barriers, trade issues. But it does require an ETS to have been stabilized and to operate for a number of years. So actually, the Korean ETS is probably quite technically suitable shortly once the cap is tightened to the EU linking. But whether there's a political willingness to do that, I don't know, and whether there's adequate relationships there. But really, the most important thing is to get things right at the national level first, because every country has to meet its own NDC targets, which are really ambitious. And an ETS can do that, or a carbon tax. But it's becoming clearer that the national level policy making is the most important. And this idea of linking is a nice to have. It's definitely going to have some benefits, but it's a longer term opportunity, I think.
Thank you so much. That has been quite insightful. So when Dylan had mentioned about environmental activism in Australia, and I was wondering whether how has there been a lot of environmental activism in South Korea, or have the naysayers been more? Have the voices of the naysayers been more powerful? Jasmine, would you like to share how has it been in South Korea?
Yes. First of all, thank you for all the insightful comments. For me, it's really not my expertise, so I feel like I learned a lot from today's conference, especially. I think in terms of what Alistair mentioned about how Korea has a very ambitious national goal, and that might not have like a direct interaction with political arena. I completely agree with that comment, because as a citizen, like Korean citizen who lives in Korea, like environmental issue hasn't really been politicized in domestic political arena, I believe. So we do recognize all the goals that has been proposed by Moon administration, especially but we don't really think people care enough to make that as a political agenda in South Korea. I mean, it hasn't really been a part of agenda in public discussion. So I think in that sense, even for, I wouldn't like to divide as a Generation Z, so-called. We do recognize there's a huge interest in other countries in newer generation in terms of environmental, protection and all that. But in Korea, it really didn't show that much of a trend. So I think as Korea has a history of putting efficiency and development much more than the equity, I think that could be also another reason why there's not much of an interest in the issue of environment as a whole. So I actually wanted to ask, Kate or Alistair about how it works for other countries, because I don't really recognize substantial environmental activism in Korea in terms of like individuals level or even in, societal level. So I feel like there's a huge disconnect between the national goal setting and also like among the people. And as Alistair mentioned, in order for this to be really sustainable, I feel like there should be a consensus in political arena, and there won't be a consensus if, people don't really have that sentiment. So apart from private sector and apart from national goal, I was just curious how it works in Australia or other countries in terms of people's level. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that one, Jasmine. I think in regards to Australia, and this is what makes me hopeful in regards to Australia's quite poor track record in climate change, is that popular opinion is for climate change action. Our politicians aren't necessarily, and I don't think it's a left or a right thing. I think political parties across all kind of sectors of Australia have had a pretty poor track record when it comes to climate change. But I think popularly amongst the people, they want climate change actions. The traditional kind of conservative populations of Australia, which is the farmers, are the ones that are experiencing climate change. So they want things as well. And there's we have the Greens Party in Australia, which is kind of like the climate change party, very progressive party. And they've actually noticed quite a shift in regional Australia, which is really conservative parts of Australia, because these farmers want action on climate change because it's affecting their livelihoods. And I think the Australian youth population in particular is it's quite similar to the UK, probably not the same amount of people just in terms of our small population, but there's a lot of protesting going on, particularly in Gen Z. I'm, a millennial, so it's nice to see these younger people going out and protesting, and a couple are using the courts, which is quite an interesting way. There's this one student at our university, Kat O'Donnell. She was in a legal studies lecture, and the lecturer lined out a way that young people could potentially sue the government for climate change, and she went ahead and did it. So she kind of based it on the Australian government wasn't preparing Australian businesses for the future, and it was the job of the government to prepare businesses and to make sure that they have economic security. So she took the government to court based on this kind of concept of sovereign bonds and superannuation. It goes quite deep into economics, and that's why my brain kind of folds over. But there's these couple of different cases you're seeing. Torres Strait Islanders in Australia taking Australia to the court as well for not doing enough to help with their homeland sinking as well. And again, we've seen it in the Pacific that the courts are being used. And I think this is quite a good way that young people and marginalised communities can do this and kind of have this climate change action. In Australia, we have a pretty popular schools for strike. So I teach international relations students at universities. Whenever there's a strike, I don't have any students show up, which is fantastic, realistically, that they're not doing that because they're out there protesting. And I think it's really exciting. I think Australia hasn't really had a big protest movement in the last few years. And I think that's reflected in social media, in people like Greta Thunberg. There's this kind of real youth action on climate change. A lot of the NGOs that we have are youth-led. And I think that's really exciting. And they are interacting with the government at quite high levels as, lobbying groups in the same way that you have lobbying groups in the United States. And I think it's really exciting. And I also think when you are campaigning for climate change, it's helpful that the words come from young people who are the most affected. You might hear someone older talk about climate change and you're kind of like, oh, that you didn't do too much when you could have, and it might not affect you as much. But when it's coming from young people, we're looking at all the speeches at COP26, the amazing speeches that are coming through. We're looking at the fields in Glasgow, and it looks really promising. When I look at what's happening inside COP26, particularly when it's just the leaders, it can be a little bit disheartening. But when you look at what's happening on the streets, it can be really exciting. And I think it's important to have that as a constant reminder to these politicians. I think politicians look in very short-term situations. What are the threats in the next 5 years? And for most countries, those threats aren't climate change. If we kind of have these young people as this reminder, whether they're using the courts, whether they're using businesses in Australia, we're boycotting certain banks that are investing in fossil fuels. Universities invest a lot in fossil fuels. My university is the first to not invest in fossil fuels. So these kind of individual actions which are led by groups. And I think Australia traditionally has a long history of climate activism in terms of the climate science. A lot of the scientists and the kind of lobbyists around climate change have come from Australia over the past few decades. So it's quite exciting. I think we have a lot of big grassroots movement. And I think you're kind of seeing that as well in the States and in the UK. And there's a lot of interaction between these groups. They're kind of organizing together to do these things. And I think that kind of grassroots political organization is quite helpful. But I also think I would like to see Australian groups organize more with youth groups. I think Australia naturally goes to the Anglosphere. We have AUKUS most recently, the security agreement with the UK and the US. And I think, Australia geographically is situated in Asia. So I think it would be great to kind of as well, if South Korean groups want more assistance in terms of how to mobilize, we could do that more. And I think that would help future collaboration and mitigation and adaptation as well. You have things like the New Colombo plan that are kind of building networks. If we can kind of build those networks around climate and sustainability, like these things here, you're all talking about all of your individual experiences of climate change. And that's what's going to make a difference, is that, again, climate change isn't personal. Rising sea levels don't stop at borders. If we can kind of collaborate, I think that's important, that youth groups and these, school strike groups aren't just looking at what's happening internally, but finding a way to support other organizations that might not have the same amount of traction overseas.
Claudine, would you like to step in?
Yes, thank you, Nazifa, and thanks everyone for the very interesting points. It's actually really nice to hear that there is strong activism in developed countries like Australia. I think it's really encouraging. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what Jasmine also mentioned, how she feels like the issue is not politicized in South Korea and that people are not taking it like maybe very seriously. Because I feel like the same thing happens in developing countries, specifically in Rwanda. Compared to the previous issue we talked about on gender equality, where we're saying that there is a problem because numbers are not available. There is no data to show the people how serious the issue is. But on the other hand, I feel like for climate change, we do have data, we do have numbers. But I feel like these numbers are actually not clear or are not made clear to the people who are being affected the most. For example, farmers in Rwanda who are going to be the most affected by this issue. They just hear that there is climate change, but they don't know what is going on, what is happening in COP26. They really have no idea about that. And they just leave this to the government. If they're lucky, then the government is going to be very transparent and they're going to go through with the plans that they've set up. But then if they don't, these people there is nothing they can do. They're far removed from all these high-level discussions that are taking place. So to me, this is very worrying. And I wonder how people who are being the most affected can actually participate in these discussions, can also say something about what is happening, because eventually they're the ones who have less capabilities to deal with the consequences that are going to be brought by climate change. So I guess this is just my frustration, the fact that something that is affecting all of us is being discussed by a very small group of people, and whether they do what they promise to do or whether they do not, we really cannot do anything about it. So yeah, that's just my frustration, basically.
Yeah, and I think, we can talk about climate change in, on our fancy laptops that are built in developing nations and manufactured in Silicon Valley, but the kind of influence that we have right here is quite minimal, and it's kind of on the governments to disseminate that knowledge, that education. You talk about gender inequality, broader inequalities as well, and that, again, climate change is a threat accelerator, it's a threat multiplier in these types of ways, and I think it's on the governments and the elite to help disseminate this information in a clear way. We can say 1.9 global warming, but whether or not the average person knows that, I don't even know if my family would in that kind of way. So we have these privileges And in that way, it's kind of also on us to make sure that the language and the information is disseminated in an equal way. But I think for those in developing nations, they don't care what happens at COP26. Realistically, that's just a kind of small group of people meeting, but they care if there's actions happening that kind of affect them. And I think this is something that developing nations really need to improve on, because again, we're not going to be affected by climate change in the same way, so that we need to help disseminate that information. It's relatively easy, I'm glancing over the problem here, but for us to reduce emissions, but less so for those in the global south. So how do we kind of empower those nations to do so? And again, you have the green climate funds that they want to have up to $100 billion US dollars, but that only got up to around about 80. So how can we kind of empower the global south to be doing more? Because we can say we can reduce emissions, but that's quite easy said and done when you have a larger population and just a bigger economic flow.
Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to hear what are the goals of the COP and what the developed countries are doing. But I want to raise a concern around local communities that are being affected in Peru, in Los Andes, by the mining industry. So Peru is the world's second largest producer of copper, silver, and zinc, and the sixth largest producer of gold. And mining represents like 60% of our exportation. So undoubtedly, mining contributes a lot to our economy. However, it's affecting a lot the local communities that lives there in the surroundings where these operations take place. So children who live near here, there are entire families who live near these operations. So they are being affected. They have a lot of health issues, and there have been some research related to the exposure to these toxic substances can cause lung damage, brain damage, kidney disease. And there have been already a lot of cases of children who have died due to cancer. And really, the government, the Peru government, doesn't do anything to protect their rights. People live very isolated. They don't have access to healthcare. They don't have access to good proper sanitation. And these big mining companies, they just take our resources, and they don't really care about the damage they are causing. Like children are dying, and they are not only like killing our people, but they also are polluting our environment. Like the water is being polluted, like they don't have access to clean water. So, and I wanna say that I think our government, Peru's government, lacks the capacity to make these big mining companies to enforce the environmental regulations for these big mining companies. But I also think these companies need to also care about the damage they are causing. Like, there is one company I read that is from Switzerland. It's called Glencore. And I always had this picture in my mind that Switzerland is a country that cares a lot about protecting the environment, but it seems like they only care about protecting the environment when it's inside their territory, or about protecting their people, but only who live in their territory. But what about developing countries? So yeah, that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thanks, Maita. And that this links pretty strongly to accountability, because we've been talking a lot about sort of this top-down policy and regulation and whatnot, but as Claudine also mentioned, like how do you sort of connect this to real people on the ground who either don't know about this or who are the worst affected by it? How do you sort of how do you link these bottom and top like levels, I guess? And I want to ask Dylan, because you put a question in our group chat last week about counteracting apathy towards climate change. And I think this is a kind of broad question, and it kind of brings in as well the role of news and education, as well as, I guess, culture more broadly, like art or literature. So I was going to start with you, Dylan, if you have any thoughts on this issue of addressing people's apathy or just not caring about climate change.
Definitely. And I think in relation to apathy and climate change, I'll probably just speak to my personal experiences. And so as a summary, in Sydney at the moment, and lockdown having emerged after 4 months. And so my locus of control, or my lived reality, has pretty much been my bedroom behind me, which for quite a long time. And when we talk about apathy to climate change, I think it's because of the privilege that I have at the moment being in Sydney, and not at the forefront of like rising sea levels and islands about to be swamped. And the fact that I know one of the readings that we sent in a group was about a text from, the text in The Guardian from Amitabh Ghosh about like where's the fiction about climate change. So looking at why authors, if they're writing about catastrophic events in climate change instantly, it's a bit like surreal and supernatural, like we can't experience it. But I think in relation to apathy to climate change, the main reason is that for a lot of people, it's not our lived reality, to be blunt. Like my main concern over the past 4 months was probably on surviving during the pandemic, like looking out for the daily case numbers, and who I was meeting. So really on that micro level of like anything I touch or anything I breathe in, like, and that was 100% of my energy. So when we're talking about climate change, which requires kind of sustained action on a daily level, but also over multiple years, it's difficult for individuals to invest 100% of their energy in that, especially when they might be facing housing foreclosures during the lockdown, or loss of work, or potential health impacts. So yeah, I guess that was my 2 cents on apathy. And I think also it kind of touches on a lot of the conversations we've had already today about the disconnect between policy and the lived realities of people. So especially when a lot of the impacts or contributors to climate change are from big businesses and governments, and that's where a lot of the discussion of focus is happening. But I think it's also important to equally focus on the experiences of the grassroots individual who might not be actively on the front lines of protests, but just like ordinary individuals. Because even though if I recycle this cup or if I recycle this bottle, it might not change the world or make a big impact, but I don't think it's necessarily on the act of recycling, but more on the attitude that it fosters. Because each person is not just a person alone. Like each person is an engineer, or each person is an artist. Each person is an accountant, and this sort of attitude of protecting our future and attitude of being a global citizen. These are things which can be fostered even on the micro level and on the daily. So when we're talking about apathy to climate change, I think it's something which we should refocus on, and I think it kind of falls onto the roles of grassroots communities, of artists, onto storytellers, like what do you do on your daily basis? If you're watching Netflix for 4 hours a day, then that is one source of being exposed or changing your views. So I think in addition to the big work which Alistair and Kate are doing in terms of like spotlighting policy discussions and shifting the discussions on those macro level, we should also think about different forms of touch points and engagements for people on the individual level, and how we can create a snowball or avalanche, so everyone in our particular specialties or industries, we have this greater global citizenship attitude. So, yeah, thank you.
Claudine, did you want to jump in?
I believe Maite raised her hand before me. Maybe I can go after her.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I'm on my phone, so I'm kind of a little blind, so no worries.
Yes, well, Dylan was talking about what we can do in a micro level. And I think like we as consumers, like we can start choosing more sustainable, like we can start making more sustainable choices. I think we have like the responsibility to get more informed and about what we always need to think before getting a product, buying something or getting a service. And for example, I know about two very interesting startups. One is from Europe, which is too good to go. And what they do is like there are some restaurants, they work with some restaurants or hotels that they have leftovers, but it's food in good condition. So they have an application where they sell these leftovers at a cheaper price. So users can buy food like a cheaper price in a good condition. And that also helps to reduce greenhouse gases. And also, for example, in Peru, there is one startup which is called Lecara. And what they do is from biodegradable materials, they make bags and leather. Yeah, they make leather. And I think if there's also like small actions we can do in our everyday lives. Even at home, I think we can do like eco garden, or we also need to be really aware. For example, when we use like plastic bags, try to be aware that don't give this bag like one single use, and try like because we never are going to reduce like to have zero negative impact. But if we try as much as we can to reduce our impact, I think it will make a great difference. Thank you.
Yes, I also wanted to talk a little bit about apathy because I personally have more faith in individuals compared to like big businesses and countries. And the reason why I say this is because, for example, in my undergraduate in South Korea, many of my classmates were trying to change their behaviors using tumblers instead of like takeout coffee cups. And recently with my classmate, we conducted a survey in Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen, looking at people's behaviors when it comes to recycling. And many people, they're trying to change their behaviors, but some say that the reason why they don't do it cycle. So to me, what this shows is that individuals are actually willing to change their behaviors, but then maybe governments are not making it easy for them, or sometimes they just get tired. Like, even if I do this, as long as big companies, big industries are not doing anything, my individual actions are actually not going to do anything. And in that sense, they kind of give up. So I feel like individuals, if governments like put effort in educating people, providing information, and like making the whole process of dealing with big industries and companies more transparent, I feel like individuals are more than willing actually, to change their behaviors.
Thanks, Claudine. It's a shame Pai's not here, because he kind of also raised this question of who is responsible. And yeah, I kind of agree that individuals, of course, have responsibility, but at the same time, our choices are very much shaped by what's available to us. And that's where I think government has a role to come in and regulate. And this is also tied up, I think, with politics and power. I mean, for example, in Korea, it's such a huge user of plastic, and there's, you know, campaigns to cut down on the use of plastic. Like, I always think, like, you buy bananas and it's wrapped up in plastic and like a styrofoam tray underneath. Like, this thing is naturally wrapped in a peel. But I guess there's issues as well. Like, for example, there's huge plastic producers in Korea that probably are not so inclined to see reductions in the use of plastic. And then, of course, there's like the issue of COVID. So I think Seoul city government last year was just about to implement a ban on using takeaway coffee cups inside cafes. But then COVID came along and they got rid of that. They were saying that it's more hygienic to just use disposable cups. So that's, yeah, that's also a big issue. Yeah, this also, I mean, Claudine, you had, sorry, I want to go to Shanuz, because you'd asked in the chat as well. This goes back more to our top-down, I guess, discussion on accountability. And you'd asked, how can developed countries help developing countries to address climate change? So, I mean, we've talked about mitigation quite a bit, which is obviously the responsibility to reduce emissions. But I just want to hear your thoughts more broadly, mainly maybe about like helping to finance climate action in developing countries, or what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Mark. So I feel like even if developing countries can you hear me? Okay. So even if like developing countries totally shift their economy to non-renewable energy, from non-renewable energies to renewable energies, then it didn't affect so much, because as we know that developing countries are contributing less than 1% to the global economy. So I feel like to mitigate these challenges and to follow an adaptation plan, developed countries need climate finance to developed countries. Is China one of the biggest exporters of coal? It stopped to export like coal to Pakistan, but what Pakistan is saying that it is like not possible for them to plan net zero in upcoming years, for example 2030, because you know it will continue the activities based on coal, and to mitigate the challenges it needs the financial support from developed countries, though it is taking initiatives like 10 billion tsunami in which it grew like 1 billion trees, and now like 9 billion remaining. And then again there's another initiative which is Clean and Green Pakistan, and there is e-vehicle policy, and then Recharge Pakistan, climate smart agriculture, and ecosystem restoration. You know, these are some of the initiatives which developing countries are taking to adapt to the changes, and also like to mitigate the challenges. And so as we saw that in COP26, even like among the 5 biggest emitters of climate, among the 5 biggest global emissions, 2 countries didn't show up. And then the third emitter like set target for net zero target for 2070. Like, so from this we can see that how these biggest emitters are taking the urgency of the problem. So instead, I think that developed countries should take the responsibility first, instead of, you know, in one article, I read that United States is blaming and shifting the blame towards China, and China is shifting the blame towards United States. As you know, one of the young activist Greta called these type of conferences as blah blah blah, because she's, according to her, she's saying that these conferences are just limited to conference rooms and theories, and just on to post on social media. So I think that world leaders need to take this challenge seriously and should implement the laws and regulations on each and every country, so that in this way we can mitigate the challenge, and we will adopt new policies for the adaptation for developing countries. Thank you.
Dylan, did you want to go?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I actually had a question for Kate and Alistair. Since we're talking about this topic of accountability, Kate, I had a quick read of the article which you sent through, and it seems like it highlights that sort of binary between a short-term focused lens and a lens for paying forward for future generations. And so my question to both of you is, how can current leaders or governments/corporations be held accountable for future generations? So I'm thinking about this in terms of from your expertise from a legislative policy level. So on an extreme level, this would mean the current prime minister is legally liable for failing to meet future targets. From your experiences, how can current leaders be held accountable for future generations? Thank you.
Alistair, did you want to jump in first?
Okay. It's a difficult one. I think that perhaps in the UK example, one of the things that's mentioned is one of the positives about the UK approach to climate change is the fact that the 2050 target is built into legislation, so it's not something that can be changed easily by one prime minister or another. And also, there's also the establishment of the Climate Change Committee, which has a specific role to independently scrutinise government policy and to monitor and report on progress against targets and to hold the government to account. So I think I don't think the UK is perfect in terms of the policies that are on the ground to achieve the targets, but it has the legislative system in place, and it has the process to track performance. So that's maybe that's not necessarily accountability, but it's I think what's important in this is that the commitments that are made by countries are not just political statements. It's easy for anybody to say by 2050 we're going to do, net zero, because they're not going to be in power then. But it's how to lock this into the policy process so that it's not susceptible to political changes. And so I think it. Yeah. And then I think that there's also, there's a whole level of implementation that's necessary as well. So, but this is no different to any other policy. The accountability of politicians and governments is applicable to environment. We've heard about environmental policy in this meeting, about the pollution that's caused and the damage of the health impacts. And that's also relevant. So climate change is not different to any other environmental policy where there needs to be accountability. But then if in the case of the quite sort of concerning situation in Peru that we heard about, there are, I guess, if the legislation is not working and if there's the compliance enforcement is not there, then public opinion can be powerful. And I think that corporations are much more sensitive to the risks of people not boycotting their product if they feel like it's not sustainable, or if they're causing harm to people unnecessarily. So there can be measures, and there can be perhaps ways in which people can hold companies to accountability if the legal system is not working. And I think there's also, I've heard about young people who will only want to work for companies that have a very proactive climate strategy, and so I think things will gradually work all in favour of accountability. But I think what really counts is what's going on the ground, because you hear some people talk about China not being very ambitious in its goals, but it tends to under-promise and over-deliver, whereas some countries do the opposite, which is perhaps worse. That's just some of my thoughts on this one.
I think it's a tricky one, because I think international law is essentially soft law. States aren't held accountable for what they commit at the United Nations, at COPs, that sort of thing. And I think that's a broader thing that we've faced with international law in the United Nations, for nearly a century now. So I think it has to come from domestic. And I think the UK is a pretty good example of how you can hold accountable in terms of a policy and legislative sense. And I think that would be good and work quite well in Australia. We tried an emission scheme years ago, but then a Conservative government got in and they repealed it. So it's like, how can you kind of depoliticize climate change? So I know, Jasmine, you were talking about how to politicize climate change. In Australia, we're talking about how to depoliticize it, because it's kind of become such a binary issue of, Australian politics. And I think that's some of the issues within Australia, is that that's a part of the thing. It's kind of become this, like, we're going into an election, one party is for climate change, one party isn't. So it's kind of looking at that one. But I think it kind of, you can intrinsic it into the legislation in Australia. It's the states that are doing the most in climate change. So we have kind of poor federal action on climate change, but the individual states are actually doing some really cool stuff. So Adelaide, Sydney and Canberra, two of our biggest capitals, are working together for net zero emissions. So again, even at the state level, you can do something in terms of climate change at the local government level as well. So I think even if you can't get it in the federal, you can get it in these smaller government roles as well. And I think on terms of empathy, I think it's important to have empathy, but also important to not have too much empathy in terms of your mental health. I'm kind of trying to transition from not thinking about the death of the earth every day. And I think COVID has kind of enhanced that existentialism and again, distracted a lot of people's kind of threat perceptions. We look quite short term in international relations. I look at conceptions of security. So it's really easy for a state to manage a security threat when that security threat is another state. So it can manage a threat, from Indonesia, from Russia, all these other states. But when the threat isn't a state, states have no idea what to do. And climate change is kind of one of those unsolvable issues in that way, is that because the threat isn't something that they can see, that they can actually easily and kind of make an enemy out of as well in that way. So I think it's quite hard, but I think it's going to have to take a whole of government approach, the legislative side of the government, the policy making side, and kind of all aspects of the government as well. And the people, buying power as well. You look in Australia, we had this documentary years ago about green energy and about the amount of waste from a coffee cup. So it was this kind of ABC on our national broadcaster. And then within a month, everyone had this one brand of coffee cups because they invested in this documentary. So you can kind of see that action. I remember when I was younger, when we had the massive drought, is everyone started timing their showers. And that was something that we still do. A lot of showers today, at least in regional Victoria, will have like an hourglass timer. So I think that is things that people can do. And we've seen that, at least in Victoria, in terms of adapting our use of water. We didn't have water fights. You only sprinkle the garden at certain points in night. when it's not going to rain. We kind of had these really tight regulations on our consumption of water, and people adapted to it pretty quickly, but that was also because they saw what was happening. So I think, again, climate change in these urban developed countries, we don't necessarily see the effects. And is that onus on, as you said, Dylan, the media, on artists? You know, at what point does Ariana Grande sing about climate change? Is that her responsibility, or is it Shell's responsibility? So it's kind of looking at, I think it's just a global problem, which is the worst and most vague answer. But I think it's going to take kind of a lot of accountability from everyone at different levels, but also making sure that your mental health isn't bad. Because again, 60% of young people experience mental health issues from climate change. So it's kind of looking after yourself in that way as well.
If I can jump in here, I think it's interesting how, like, you know, Kate, you mentioned about how it's still politicized in Australia, but I really do think this issue is very depoliticized in Korea, yet there are so many regulations that Korean people just follow because it's decided by the government. Like, for example, like there are many things that have been set for such a long time that we don't really recognize it's for a climate, like it's for environmental friendly policies. For example, like Korea, it's very strict on recycling. So we have a very strict recycling policy that since we were really young, we were trained to recycle, like, you know, food and plastic and then bottles. So it is almost like a norm in society, I would say. And also, like, from like 1995, we had this garbage disposal rule that, like, based on like amount of garbage that you take it out from your house, you have to pay different amount of money. And then, you know, from now on, like, ever since like the government started to care more about this environmental issues, now we have to pay for a plastic bag because before it was given. So like I do think there are changes that has been happening, like top down, like especially like, you know, like you I think Alistair, I don't know like which one, like who mentioned it, but someone mentioned about like huge plastic uses in Korea, and I think like because of delivery and because of all the conveniences that we have in Korea, I think there's a huge plastic usage. And recently, one of the biggest company in Korea that delivers, it's like Amazon in Korea, I guess. It's called Coupang, and they recently had like huge amount of like fee that they have to pay because of the over plastic usage. If I remember correctly, I think it was like $5 million or something. So they couldn't like really ignore it from that point. So I think what I'm trying to make, the point that I'm trying to make here is there are a lot of top-down policies in Korea that people don't really think of the end of the earth, but they still do it because it's the regulation and regulations. But I was just curious how sustainable this would be, or how meaningful this would be, because as Kate mentioned, I feel like accountability, obviously we should mention about accountability like across countries, but I do think like accountability should be shared even like inside of the country, right? So my curiosity is like about like examples or possibilities as a legislative point of view that this environment policy domestically can be more of a governance form rather than the top-down, you know, structure, right? Because like maybe I'm coming from very idealistic view because I'm not really involved in this specific area, but I feel like for the issue of environment, it's an issue that many people can agree, and there's not much of a different interest, I believe, compared to other issues relatively, because we do all agree that we have to do something. So I was just curious, like in domestic level, in terms of making policies, there's some kind of like governance formation among like, you know, like legislative branch and then like consumers and also the private sectors to actually make environmental policy inside of the country. So I was just curious and wanted to ask like questions that is there like specific like form of, you know, for policy formation that have been done simultaneously with different sectors of the country, or is that normally a top-down policy that has been performed like it has been going on in Korea? Thank you.
Alistair, would you like to take that question?
I think that, yeah, sure. you talk about the role of consumers or the the private sector and other things. I think a lot of my experience was with the European Commission policy development process. So we used to do a lot of work on impact assessment of different policy proposals. And that is a good example, I think, of how all of the relevant stakeholders are consulted, and the impact assessment structure, similar to the UK impact assessment structure, explicitly requires the impacts on all key stakeholder groups to be properly assessed and to be quantified, both economic and social and environmental. And through the stakeholder engagement process, there's a lot of opportunity for people to engage in the process. And I think what that does is it helps to make good policy, because often it's basically, I guess the way that they develop the policy is that they say, well, this is our business as usual, but then we have options 1, 2, and 3, and these are the costs and benefits of these options, and then we recommend option 2 because of this reason. I think I'm less familiar with the detail in Korea in terms of policy development, but my impression is it's less transparent, and the stakeholder engagement I've heard is perhaps more nominal and not so thorough. And so I think it's because of the way in which the policy development works in the EU, it means also that they're very successful in transferring proposals into actual policy, and they're usually quite successful policies because they've got a lot of. And also, I think another critical issue is that the policy design requires real insight, and often it's the industries and the stakeholder groups that've got the best insight into how the policy can work and so on. But one thing that's interesting that I heard is the last couple of weeks, which is interesting about Korea, was about the change in the attitude. I mentioned earlier about the change in the power sector, power market to support the shift away from coal, and quite a significant policy will be implemented from next year to enable a mechanism to do this. And there was a complete turnaround in this, because this was a policy that was stuck for a long time, and this environmental merit order to be able to reflect carbon cost into power station dispatch was a critical issue to be able to decarbonise the power sector. And there was a lot of pressure from the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy to not have this done, because there's vested interests to try and, because coal is probably more profitable, or has been. So there's certain vested interests that were blocking this happening. But all of a sudden, it's now happened. It's now been passed because of the realization that Korea needs to shift away from coal, and it's so far not been successful. So it was just very interesting to me how that is probably public opinion also driving that dissatisfaction, the status quo, and then the realization that Korea is so far from where it needs to be. So I think it was really encouraging to me to realize how quickly policy can change, and how quickly things, you think forever they'll never be able to, MOE will never be able to persuade MOTI to implement this policy, because MOTI is so strong and powerful and MOE is so relatively less powerful. But things can change quite quickly, and maybe that's also the role for the population groups in general. And also Cheongnam in Korea, the powering past coal, that was a province that's really been proactive to try and push ahead with shifting away from coal. And this is now, within COP, there's various commitments now to move away from coal. So that was a local action in Korea against the national government position. So I think it's just interesting to realize how things can change, and how stakeholders can really have an impact if things aren't working too well.
Loic, did you want to step in?
Yes. Well, thank you very much for those comments. Actually, my initial reactions may be concerned a bit less these policies, but more accountability in the topics we were talking about slightly earlier. So I think the first thing before talking about accountability is also the access to information. This is something that I think was quite noticeable in previous years. I think the most prominent examples are maybe, Bolsonaro and Trump and social media. It's always topics that are close to my heart. But relating more to Switzerland, there was always it's always a bit of a gray zone because people think they're aware, and sometimes the problem is just too complex to understand, right? Some people, it's just too easy to buy a new pair of jeans in a new supermarket. It's difficult to understand the impact it has on bushfires the other side of the globe. And every now and then, there's always a few scandals. I think last week there was an inquiry into investment funds from Swiss banks, that they're green funds, where they only disclose the top 10 companies they invest in. Actually, the smaller shares in the fund were companies that were polluting heavily, as you mentioned, Gabriela. They had Lonza, Holcim. So there's always this access to information that at some point is a bit blurred. And what I think happened is that it made a shift to an individual accountability in a way, where you'd have these cultural policies that kind of came into place. I'd say it's maybe with regards to littering, food consumption. There's getting very popular for people to give up meat or beef because of environmental reasons. Mobility as well, with less and less of my friends, people my generation that own a car or just want to for environmental reasons. And I think it's more and more sensitivity to it. And if it's access to, in a way, the reliable information or awareness to the issue, then this can do a lot. And maybe a final point, to turn back the conversation to policy is also who is accountable. I think is a question by us that's very difficult to answer in Switzerland, because you're not sure whether it's the multinationals that are in Switzerland and that finance actually many of the disastrous companies worldwide, or what's actually happening on site. And it's an ongoing debate that's, I think, probably the peak of it was maybe last year. We had a national vote on whether to hold Swiss companies responsible for any type of human rights or environmental abuses abroad, which got rejected in a way because they thought it was too complex or too punitive for Swiss companies. So even if there was a real strong will, I think, from the population to understand, the impact of, these large corporations in a developed country like Switzerland and their impact abroad. But it was a question that was, in a way, in my view, too complex to identify and define, and that because of that didn't enter into force. I think because of a lack of being able to define exactly who is accountable. So yeah, that's my point of view, anyways, for how it is back home. But I think it's encouraging. I think on the individual level and with this generation, there's a newfound sensitivity to it. I think it's moving in the right direction, but it's really difficult to completely understand the magnitude of the problem.
Thank you, Loic, for your comments. And I think it kind of highlights the difficulty of accountability in climate change and policies, especially with everyone's unique context, which government it is, which stakeholders are involved. And actually on that note, I wanted to pivot slightly and asking to Alistair and Kate. One element of climate change loss and damage is the non-economic forms of loss and damage. So we're looking at, for example, identity and agency. We're looking at communal sites, values, cultural artifacts. So to Alistair and Kate, I wanted to ask you, in regards to being accountable for non-economic loss and damage, what does this look like?
Yeah, I think it looks like different things to different communities. So say, Indigenous conceptions and relationships to land are going to vary between community to community. In Samoa and the Solomon Islands, when someone passes away, their body on their motherhood homeland. But if that homeland is disappearing, they're not going to be able to have that same relationship. That's a part of their kind of familial relationship to land. And that's going to be quite different. That's not a kind of cross-cultural phenomenon. And I think it's going to look different to different groups. And I think that's kind of what we have to talk about. And again, when we're talking about accountability and mitigation, is that all of these things are going to look different to different groups. We know a lot about climate change, we're quite privileged, we have access to education, but most people don't. And they also might not want to. They have other concerns, getting the food on their table for their family. They're working a lot more hours, these kind of basic things. So I think, we're in quite a privileged position that we even know about climate change beyond the kind of Earth is changing. But I think at the basic level, communities recognize that something's happening to the environment, and that's going to kind of influence whether or not they know, 1.9, global emissions scheme, all of these types of things. I think that people don't necessarily have to know that to do something about climate change. You just have to recognize the climate's changing. But I think in terms of action for cultural communities, you can't really put a price on your relationship to land in any sort of way. And I think that we're going to have to look at, I know that's something in the Pacific they're looking at, is in how do you adapt and how do you maintain your relationship to land when that land no longer exists. So for many Pacific Islanders in Kiribati, some will move to Fiji, but that's not the same. They're still not going to have that relationship to land. And I think that that's something as Western, white, developed nations has really been underestimated in our kind of international policy making on this, because we don't have those same relationships to land and Indigenous conceptions. And that's, again, those kind of non-economic factors that you can't put a price on. And I think that that's one of the downsides to climate policies. And unfortunately, a lot of those connections and relationships to land and those cultures and those historical practices that kind of exist far beyond. Australia was only around in 1788. Like, that's such a small amount of time to the relationship with land that have been there for hundreds of centuries and years. And I think that that's just something, don't want to say that we should accept it, but I think that that's something that should be looked at in a lot more depth, and how you improve those relations to land. I think it's a hard question. I think you can't put a price on these types of things, and you can't have a policy you can't have a policy that polices your relationship to land. That's just kind of incredibly intrusive and also quite colonial in that same way. So I think that these are just one of the things that we're going to have to grapple with losing in the future, unless we do something, yesterday.
Thanks a lot. Please go ahead, Alistair.
Yeah. So in terms of the examples of non-economic impacts, I think that this can be regarded as another type of environmental policy, climate change. And there's quite a long history of taking into account the impacts of environmental policy and the benefits of more stringent policy. And I agree that some impacts and some benefits are difficult to quantify and monetize. But there's a long history of being able to do this in terms of express a willingness to pay for a better place to live, or a better environment. And in some ways, that's quite similar, whether you're talking about environmental pollution, toxic waste, or bad air quality, or as the same as sea level rise. So I think that there's a lot of experience and lot of good work that's been done on quantifying all this. But if we're talking about balance of costs and benefits and the rationale for taking action, well, that's also, that comes down to, the impact assessment and the actual assessment of the benefits of climate action. From what I've come across, the benefits always far outweigh the costs, and there's clearly huge uncertainties. But I think that if you're looking at whether the decision is going to be swung by just looking at one particular community and whether they're, how much is it worth protecting that community? It seems to me like the balance is much more stark. The difference is so much more weighted on the side of the benefits versus the costs. But I think it's good to realize, it's good to think that climate change is not different to environmental policy in general, and to realize that there's a huge body of knowledge and expertise in being able to deal with these types of problems. And it might be the context might be different and the application might be different, but the methodologies are the same. And that's, again, I think the EU has been very good in detailed methodologies for quantifying costs and benefits of policies and dealing with some quite difficult non-economic examples, which I agree are not easy, but there's quite a lot of experience. But overall, it seems to me like the benefits generally outweigh the costs, especially when you bring into account the secondary benefits of improved air quality or other issues. And also the last point I'd make is that the costs of climate mitigation are also getting cheaper and cheaper because we're talking about switching to renewable energy, which is becoming a lot cheaper. We're talking about technologies that are becoming cheaper all the time. So if we talk about the cost of achieving net zero, the UK estimated the cost of achieving net zero by 2050 is less than 1% of GDP. I mean, that will vary by different country to country, but I think that Arnold Schwarzenegger was saying last week about, he was making comments about this as well. It's a win-win situation in terms of job creation and also climate mitigation. And the people that are creating barriers have got vested interests typically. Hopefully things will become easier to push for more ambitious action, and especially now that people have signed up to these net zero commitments by 2050. The question is, how can we get there most cost effectively? How can we get them most quickly? Not whether we should get there, because they're already signed up and they're already commitments.
Thank you, Alistair. So we've heard a lot from our cohort today regarding what concerns us the most, but we would like to conclude the session by asking our guest speakers, what in your opinion were issues or policy options or solutions that did not receive enough attention in the climate change or environmental discourse globally that should have, it's not receiving enough attention right now, for example, something that should have been talked about in COP26 or so on at the national level. So Alistair, would you like to go ahead first?
So you think what topics that haven't been picked up in COP26 that should be, or?
Yes, in your opinion, from your work experience and all.
That's a difficult one. I think that I think the challenge is becoming not so much about national commitments, but about implementation and planning. And there's a whole pile of commitments that are now been made, but how are they going to get there? And I think that the issues are really about how countries can work out the policy mix to, when they're looking at the power sector, the industry sector, the transport sector, the building sector, the agricultural sector, how are they going to actually decide and work out the right policy mix to navigate this, and how are they going to work out the right combination? And so there's a huge amount of work to do, and also how can that be done most economically? That's probably one step below the NDC level, but it's something that we're working on in Southeast Asia with a new project, but I think it's also the role of policies as well, in terms of how the effective policies that exist in some countries can be more quickly implemented by others. Because, for example, a number of countries are starting with an emissions trading system, but it's almost too late. Everybody's got to start making reductions today. They can't. Some countries have spent 10 years planning and thinking about designing a perfect policy, but that can't happen anymore. There's no longer any time to spend 10 years at the planning stage. There's a whole, the urgency has just completely become so apparent. And I think that's more about more rapid implementation of policy that's critical. And particularly if you're going to achieve anything in 2030, it's not only about having the policy in place, but it's about having industry to respond and invest and implement. So there's such little time. So that's more to do with perhaps capacity building, experience sharing, learning from best practice more quickly. But that's an area that we're quite active involved in, particularly in Asia. With, for example, we have a dialogue facility on ETS development in Asia, sharing experience across countries, but that needs to happen much more quickly. And then issues like in China, for example, how they're going to make the emissions trading system work for their power sector, and the power market reform is a critical element to that, and that could take another 5 years. So it's just this. I think that the real issues are at that policy level, personally.
Yeah, I think just seconding everything you said, Alistair, the kind of how and the implementation of the policy. But I think when I broadly looked at last week's COPs and this week's kind of policy side of it, I think it's done a pretty good job. Like, I can't really necessarily fault too much of it, but I think just more Indigenous inclusion in the policy side of things. Like, we've kind of all seen the speeches that were done by young people, by women, by people who are experiencing climate change, but I think perhaps more in the implementation side of things. And I think that can be done, you know, at the broader international COP perspective, but also just kind of more regional action. Like, I think I look in Australia, we're kind of surrounded by some of the most heavily affected climate change regions. We've got the Pacific, we've got Southeast Asia. So if there's a way we can kind of combine those regional responses, I think kind of looking more regionally at how is the region affected and how can states in that region help the states that are going to be affected. And I think taking a little bit more of a bottom-up perspective of the actual policy framework kind of at the higher level. But I mean, I could say that not all policy should be a little bit more bottom-up. But I think when we're looking at climate change, looking at, you know, who will be affected for the worst group of people and making your policy around that group as opposed to the top group.
All right, guys, the time is up, unfortunately, and I know that this has been one of the topics that you guys are most interested in. So unfortunately, we have to end here. Thank you, Nazifa and Mark, for moderating today's sessions. And Alistair and Kate, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join our discussion today. The only question or request I may have is, this is probably one of the hundreds and thousands of discussions about climate issues that's taking place around the world. And if there is anything that our group can do to make ourselves noticed, or if there are any initiatives that you're currently working on, and if there's anything that our cohorts can participate in to make any difference, please let us know. I'm sure that they would love to get involved. As you may have noticed, they're not all in Korea. Dylan's in Australia, Nazifa is in England, Claudine in Rwanda, Maide in Taiwan. We have Shanice joining from Bangladesh, and Natasha, although she's not on the screen, Natasha is joining us from Sri Lanka. So they're all over the world trying to make a difference. So please reach out to us anytime, and they're here to really to actively get engaged. Thank you again, everyone. And our discussion will take place 2 weeks from now. And until then, have a great day and goodbye.